Hi everyone, this is the water pump and reinstallation procedures performed on a 2004 Chrysler Sebring with a 2.7 liter engine. I'm sure it's applicable to multiple model years, and it's also applicable, I guess you could say, to the Intrepid, which has the same engine, but it's mounted, it's a rear-wheel drive car, so it's mounted the other way. The process is significant in its involvement, and the time commitment is pretty high for most people. You can expect to spend 2 to 3 days in the process. I'm able to do it in one day and be done before dinner, but that's because I've done it before and I've got all the tools and I know which tools to use and so on and so forth. So give yourself ample time if you've never done anything like this before. Essentially, what has to be done is there is the intake manifold on top, pictured here, has to be removed along with both valve covers. The cooling system needs to be drained. The front cover has to come off. The timing chain has to be removed. It's very difficult to remove the pump without removing the chain. Tensioner has to come out. Guides have to come out for the chain because this is a chain-driven water pump. And then the pump can be accessed at that point, and then reverse the procedure to install. So that's why it takes so long and it's rather involved.
First thing we did was remove the plastic cover from inside the wheel area here. If you want to disconnect the battery, you have to do that from the other side, removing the wheel and removing clips or bolts from the inner fender well to get to it. So the first step is I'm going to remove the tensioner pulley for the serpentine belt, the outer serpentine belt, which runs the AC compressor and the alternator, and the mount bolt for the harmonic balancer. And to get that bolt out, you want to remove the, unless you have an impact, you're going to remove this bracket. It's a support bracket between the transmission and the engine. Above that is an inspection cover with 10mm headed bolts so that you can put a pry bar in there holding the starter ring gear still while you use I believe it's a 17mm socket to remove that nut. So here's the tensioner. There's a pivot bolt, a sliding adjustment bolt, 13mm. Pretty easy to get out, especially if you just go ahead and take this one all the way out. Then you can get that one out and the whole thing falls out. And you might want to pay attention to the belt routing. There is a label under the hood and it shows you the routing of it. But what you have is it's coming down off the alternator, around the crank, up to the compressor, around the pulley, and back to the alternator again. The condition that we have is what appears to be a leaking water pump. Even though the pump is underneath this cover, there's no leakage here. There's a weep hole that's actually further back that will leak from this area here and down onto the pan area. That's just the way the pump's designed. It doesn't leak into the interior cavity there where the timing belt is. So it's a bit tricky, I think, to diagnose. There's a plastic housing just to the right of the weep hole, and that's an inlet, and the thermostat housing is in there as well, which I can show you what that looks like. So that's this. There's the thermostat with the gasket. So it sits in there like this, and the notch at the bottom here, that's where the weep hole is. It's extremely difficult to see, but at just the right angle from underneath the car, you can get eyes on where that weep hole is. I should probably explain, the weep hole is it's a hole that's at the bottom of the water pump, and what it does is it gives the coolant a place to go when that seal at the pump shaft starts to fail, which often it's because the bearing begins to fail or the bushing that the pump rides in, and that causes the seal to waller out a little bit, and then it starts leaking.
To get the bolt off of the harmonic balancer, you gotta lock the crankshaft in place unless you have an impact. So for this job I didn't have that, so I just used a 1/4 inch extension bar with the inspection cover removed from the transmission bell housing, and just rotate the engine over until I found there's several holes in the flex plate, and just slid this into one of the holes, and it jammed the extension bar up against the engine block, actually the oil pan, and then I could break the bolt loose on the harmonic balancer.
So we had to to remove the pulley. It is a press fit, so pry bars don't work. You got to get a puller. The Napa puller didn't work, so we ended up with a puller from AutoZone. It's pretty straightforward. It's got a bolt with a hole in it, then they give you extensions, so you slide this in there, run this through your puller, and then you hook on to the innermost portion here and to pull it off. 27,139. Alright, so in getting to this, you can take this hose back so that you can get down. There's a bolt up on top on this cover that has to come out in order for you to get the front cover off. To do that, it's almost easier just to pull this bottle out of the way so you've got some room to bring that back. In our case, I guess this is kind of a common deal. These break. These are, you know, it's a housing for your temperature sensor and your bleeder, and so we're gonna have to replace this anyway. The order is to lift the intake manifold, and so you just go through and take the bolts out. And there's one more back here underneath the cover where the 2 throttle cables come in. Next, we're taking the power steering pump out so we can get to the hydraulic tensioner, which screws in from the driver's right side of the block, I guess that would be, which is the one that's close to the firewall. So there's a couple bolts that you get to from underneath with a 13 and a long extension, and that takes the bracket loose, because just removing the pump from the bracket is nearly impossible without taking the bracket out. And there's the final bolt just in front of that tab, and it's probably a 15mm that holds that the top of the front cover on. So with maybe a little more effort than what should be necessary, that upper bolt, finally got that out. There's an engine pickup point. Looks like it's tied into that right there. But anyway, it takes that out. So I ended up taking the water bottle out. There was just a lot of hoses laying on top of it. It's easier just to get in there and do that. Also, this upper hose is for the power steering, which is, it's pretty easy to unbolt that. It's just one bolt that holds that reservoir down. You can move that up out of the way. And then the lower hose is a hard line for coolant. And there's 2 bolts that hold that in place. There's one up at the front, up against the body, and the other one is down here in the back in the same spot. Both of them are pretty easy to get to with 10mm. That just gives you some room to get the mount to move, so you can clear this bolt to get the cover out. I still don't have the mount out, but I don't think we really need to take it out all the way. Just going to go with that. Okay, so where we're at now is we got the front cover off, the lower cover off. Valve covers have to come out, so the intake manifold has to come off. Spark plugs come out, so go ahead and mark those before you pull them. So the intake was pretty straightforward, just 10mm headed bolts, real easy to get off the top. Disconnect your connectors. The connectors, some of them have locks on them, some of them don't. So if you see, I don't know if I have an example here. Here's one right here. You see the red lock there. On the side that has the tab sticking out, you can squeeze those together and then pull them out the other side. So they're not too difficult to remove. Some have a sliding latch on them, so that latch would slide back, and then you can disconnect it that way. The one in the back here was a little tricky because they had one of these connectors. They had one of these covering the stud, where the nut is, and those are again 10 millimeter as well. And then there was another one down here right next to it, the very next stud. That one was covered by a wire retention tab, and it's pretty easy to see with a mirror, so you probably want to get a mirror so you can see that and get that off of there. So here we got that cover off, and so what I did was went ahead and rotated the engine around to what looks to be top dead center for cylinder number 1. There's a mark there, so, and there's a mark on the crank. Okay, so that's how I rotated that around to line that up. And then up above, they're using on the right bank, or I guess this would be the left bank actually, but it's the forward bank. They're using a hollow flex switch for the ignition timing down below. And on the sprocket, they do have an arrow there that points at that switch. So if you can see it with the reflection of the light. Yeah, it's pretty difficult to see in the video, but it is there. So that's lined up. And then on the other pulley, it's really difficult to get in there, but there is a mark at the bottom pointing to what looks like basically just straight down. So what I did was I went ahead and created my own timing marks. You can see it's really simple. Yep. So this cap that I've got a mirror on shows that's what covers the tensioner for the timing chain, so that has to be removed. And there's two 10 millimeter bolts that need to be removed. They're 10 millimeter head. So this is what the tensioner looks like once it's out, and I just put some pressure on the back side of the chain, which was pressing up against the guide that this presses on, and that popped it right out. So it's got an O-ring seal there, and the only thing that's holding it in then is the cap. So here's the plate that covers it, and you see it's got an index pin right there, so you can't put it on wrong. It's got a rubber seal that seals it off. Alright, so next comes, we've gotten most of the bolts out of the pump, but some of the bolts are hidden by the guide. The guide has to come out. To get the guide out, you got to take the bolts out. To get the bolts out, the upper, you got to take out these plugs. So this is a 10 millimeter Allen. So with that removed, you can go in with a ratchet and a socket on a 13, I believe it is, and get the upper bolt out for the guide, and then you can get this one out, and then that should get us a lot closer. But there's a bracket that holds one of the bolts. There's a bracket that's up there. So there's one of them, and then there's a bracket that's holding, as you can see, and then behind this guide is another one. So here's the lower guide off that side, so I can get to those bolts behind the water pump. I just slid it out the bottom. So we did have to take off the pulley at the front, and to do that we had to pull the switch out to clear the triggering portion of that gear. In order to get to this bolt down here, this bracket extends down, and it sits in front of the pump. So to get the pump clear, to pull it out, we do have to get this bracket out of the way. So there's a bolt here and a bolt that goes through the pump down below. So here on the other side, we need to get that bolt out to release that bracket, which is, I believe, also the guide actually. Again, in order to get the pump out, that has to come out. Alright, so all we did was loosen that bolt a couple turns because it was difficult to work with, and that was enough. By dropping the chain, we could get enough slack to get the water pump out. So water pump now on the table, new water pump going in. Time to change directions. So here's our old pump, which has a metal and rubber combo gasket, almost like a shim. And then the new one we picked up from AutoZone. It's just a hard gasket. It sits kind of loose on the pins, so it'll probably be a little bit challenging to get it in there. But
now I should probably stop right here and just mention how critical this part of the process is. First, you want to make sure you prep the surface of the engine immaculately, that there is absolutely no gasket material or debris or anything on that surface. So you want to carefully clean that, so that you don't want to mar the surface with anything sharp. But you're going to use your towel and your brake cleaner and maybe your fingernails, and you're going to clean that surface and prep it immaculately. And then this is one of the reasons I removed the guides and the timing chain, not to mention it looked like I wasn't going to be able to get the pump out if I didn't. But B, to get it out of the way so that when I set this pump in there, there's less of a chance of me touching anything and getting oil on that gasket surface on the way in. If you suspect that's happened as you're installing this, because I know it's a little tricky, pull it back out, clean it, check it. This gasket surface the gasket itself has a coating on it, so you don't want to get too aggressive on the cleaning of the gasket. You just want to prep it well so that when you set this up there with the gasket, you don't touch anything. And then put your bolts in. You're going to tighten everything down in a star pattern, good and tight. Don't get crazy with it, but it's good and tight. And then you can finish with the installation. Now at this point, we had already installed the front cover, and we were to the point where it was time to install the harmonic balancer. Now, nobody in town had an installation tool, and I have an installation kit, but the thread and bolt diameter, it's a 14 millimeter crankshaft bolt, and it's like a 2.0 thread pitch. Nobody had this tool, and so what I did was I fashioned one from my kit and bought the necessary parts you see listed here from Fastener, and it was about 34 bucks. So it's just a long bolt with a nut and a washer, and then I used the bearing from my installation kit, and then the harmonic balancer goes behind that, and then just crank the nut down, and that pushes the harmonic balancer on the shaft. I don't recommend using a hammer to tap it on. I know there are people that do that, but it's risky because there's a thrust bearing inside there that you're pounding on whenever you slam on it with a hammer. That thrust bearing is in the crankshaft. Sometimes it's just cut into the shaft. Other times it's an actual bearing, and you risk damaging that. So really the right way to do it is to either find or fashion your own installation tool. And this worked really well, by the way. Once the harmonic balancer is installed, you'll need to put that pin back in to lock the crankshaft in place so you can tighten down your harmonic balancer bolt.
So valve covers are on. The only thing I might recommend here is where these negative terminals come in and hook up to the valve cover, just keep track of the little nuts that hold those in place. They have one on both sides, both valve covers. One way to do that is just to put the nut back down on the stud when you pull it off, to get that out of there, because you need to do that in order to get the stud out so that the valve covers will come off, which all of the nuts for the valve covers are retained, so they don't actually come out all the way, but enough that you can get it out of there. And it's easier to remove the rear cover with the engine lowered, so just off of the engine mount, up at the front engine mount, which is also the right side, I guess. Okay, so the front cover's back in, and that's what has the mounting points for the front engine mount. Well, the right side engine mount, depending on your perspective. So we got the cover in, and through the job I only ended up removing this one inspection cover in order to get the bolt out of one of the guides. The rest of them I was able to reach with wrenches without any problem. So we're just putting that upper engine mount in. So we just jack the engine up high enough. So it's 2 bolts from down below that go through the frame here up into the bracket, and then 3 bolts that head down into the cover that we already mounted. Okay, so we started by bringing the chain up for assembly and just kind of looped it over the cams, and then I brought in this cam gear first, and the arrow mark. There's an arrow mark, index mark on these 2 cam gears, and it points sort of downward at an angle like this. So that goes on there like that. And what I did was I just took, with the crank still indexed at TDC, we set it up so that once we had put the guides in, which was the next step, that this would be tight coming up this side, and then coming up on this side I put the second gear on. We managed to get the tensioner in. It was a bit tricky. We had to use a pry bar to push that in far enough from underneath, and then we got the plate mounted on there.
Now this is a hydraulic tensioner, but it also has a spring in it, and the tensioner has an installation position that is nearly completely compressed, and that's the way it'll be when you buy a new one. You push in on the piston and release it, and it will pop out with its spring tension. So when you go to install this, you do not want that released. You want it compressed. Even with it compressed, which is the way it came out of the box. We bought one at AutoZone, I believe. Even with it compressed like that, it's still going to require some effort to get the cap on it. It still sticks out too far. So you still have to do some prying to get it into the bore far enough to get the plate on. Now, I would assume for some reason when we pried on it, it stayed in place long enough for us to get the plate on, which is tricky. It could be because there was varnish built up in the bore. I don't know, but essentially once you get the cap on there, all you have to do is apply some pressure to the back side of the chain, which transmits pressure through the tensioning guide into that tensioner, and then release it, and it will pop out and take up the slack.
But we chose to take the tensioner guide, the bolt out, so that we had a little more slack to work with. Whether that's absolutely necessary or not, I don't know. That's what we chose to do, and then we put the guide in. We finished putting the guide in later. So it looked like all the marks lined up. I went ahead and rotated the engine over twice, rechecked the marks, and I'm just looking at the paint marks that I made. And it's on. So that's where we're at. And I went ahead and put the switch back in, Hall effect switch, and now we're going to go to the power steering pump and put that in. So it's just kind of reverse order from here. We used vice grips to take tension off when we were setting things up here, and so the challenge of putting the chain on is just when you're rotating this around to take the chain tension off so that you can get everything set properly, that you don't move the crankshaft at the same time, that everything stays in time as you're working through it. So one of the things that I always do is I take the spark plugs out. That takes the compression pressure out of the mix, and then all you're fighting is spring pressure, which is going to try and rotate this off center, off from where you want it to be. So it's definitely a lot easier with 2 people. Maybe even 3 would be good, but 2 people can get it done.
Every time I get into a project of this magnitude, I always take some photographs along the way. It's just a good idea to have some photographic evidence as to how hoses route, wires route, what they connect to, and so on and so forth. So as you progress through something like this, I would recommend you take some pictures, videos, what have you. It can really come in handy later on. So obviously I left several things out of this video that were just sort of minute details that I really didn't think you would need to know about. You'd be able to figure those out on your own. I didn't want this to be a nut and bolt process, and for it to be that laborious. That if you're going to dive into something of this complexity, you pretty much know what you're doing anyway. But I wanted to give you a little more information than anything else that I've found online so far. So I hope this was helpful. If you've never done anything like this, or what you have done hasn't been quite this extensive, there's a couple things that you'll want to watch out for when you start messing with timing chains. Is that you'll two things that I typically see, because this wasn't my car, this was my friend's car, and I was just helping him through it. And I'm experienced as an automotive service tech, and I'm educated as an auto service tech. So anyway, for one thing that I see is that a lot of guys will have struggle with understanding they need to clean their gasket surfaces before they reassemble anything. So I always use a cloth and brake cleaner on that cloth to clean and prep everything, and make sure all the surfaces are sparkling clean. So, and then now this project was done on a shoestring. He didn't have the money to do everything properly, which would have meant all new chains, tensioning guide, gaskets, everything. Um, so all we did was the basics here, just the tensioner, the pump, and an oil change and the thermostat. But just so you know, this is a Mitsubishi engine. Most of the gaskets on this engine are rubberized, and what I found out over the years working as a tech on foreign cars, I worked in a foreign garage, is that those gaskets for the most part are reusable. Okay, you do take a risk reusing those gaskets, but in this case, he lucked out. We reassembled them with the existing gaskets, and it all worked great. We did use new gaskets for the water pump, of course, and there was some water pump. There was a housing for the thermostat and another housing up on top of the engine you saw was missing. Those we used new gaskets on. Anything water pump related, water pressure related, I replace. But when it comes to oil that's not under pressure, like a timing cover, you might be able to get away with just reusing what you have. And he did. He was really fortunate. Didn't have to mess with it. So is this something you can do? I would say yes, you can if you're patient with yourself. The two things that people get into trouble with is prepping the surfaces, as I said, and secondly, then the other challenge will be getting the cam and crankshaft timing set correctly. So I alluded to how to go about doing that briefly in the video, that how I set the tension up on the right side, brought that over the top, down around the pump, back up over the second cam, and then the idea is to have all the slack on the tensioner side, so that you've got everything in time before you release the tensioner. And it's tricky, and it does throw people off. They'll be trying to rotate the cams, and they'll pull the crank with it, and it'll slip out of position, and they think they're in time up top, but then down below they're not. So that's the kind of thing where having a couple guys, instead of just one person, will probably go a long way to making this job tolerable for you, and give you the success you're looking for. Just remember, once you release the tensioner, rotate the engine over twice, as I explained, and then recheck your marks, making sure they're spot on. If they're off, they're going to be off a full tooth, so it's going to be pretty obvious that you didn't get it right. So if it looks like it's just a hair off, it's probably right on. Other than that, I can't make any promises for how this is going to work out for you, but I do wish you the best of luck. And of course, if you want to send me any questions or comments or what have you, that I could have done a better job, just go ahead and post it on my channel, and I'll be happy to help you as I can. So good luck.